President Obama has named his choice to succeed Antonin Scalia on the U.S. Supreme Court. Good afternoon. I'm Dave Morris here in the Oklahomans Video Studio. Obama's choice is Merrick Garland. He's Chief Judge, U.S. District Court of Appeals, D.C. Circuit, 63, considered to be a moderate nominee and a familiar name with Oklahomans. We are joined via Skype from Washington, D.C. By Kerry Watkins, Executive Director of the Oklahoma City National Memorial. Kerry, thank you for your time today. Paige, we're hearing a bit of feedback there, and I think it's a bit of a delayed loop. Kerry Watkins again joining us via Skype from our studios in Washington, D.C. Kerry, how are you today?
Good, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I mentioned that Merrick Garland is a familiar name to Oklahomans, and how do you know him?
Well, we came to know Merrick just through this story. I mean, he was one of the first names we were given when we started looking for oral histories. I'm good, Dave. Good, Dave. Thanks. Well, we came to know Merrick through really this story and writing this story.
Yeah, just come back to me real fast. All right, a bit of an audio problem here in the studios. We'll get this fixed and check back in with Kerry Watkins here in just a second. Stay with us. From the Oklahomans Video Studio, I'm Dave Morris. This afternoon, President Barack Obama announced his nomination to succeed Antonin Scalia on the U.S. Supreme Court. It's Merrick Garland. He is currently Chief Judge, U.S. District Court of Appeals, D.C. Circuit, and a name familiar to Oklahomans. Joining us once again from Skype from our studio in Washington, D.C., Kerry Watkins, Executive Director of the Oklahoma City National Memorial. Kerry, again, thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Well, of course, you know Merrick Garland quite well. He spent time and lived in Oklahoma City for quite a while back in the mid-90s following the Oklahoma City bombing memorial. And I guess my question to you, what can you tell us about Merrick Garland, the man?
Well, I think Merrick's a very fair man that understands process and believes in the process of fairness and openness and building trust. And I think one of the stories that stands out to me is when he was flown by the FBI plane to come to Oklahoma City on that Friday after the bombing. He would be one of the first to do a preliminary hearing for McVeigh at Tinker out in the JAG courtroom. And when he got it there, he realized there was no media present. And one of the things he felt that was important was to bring the media in. And the FBI then said, well, we're on an Air Force base. And he said, exactly, and you're the FBI, so you guys go work it out. And we'll hold this hearing when we have some representation of the media. And so as he reflected on that story, I've heard that story from both media and from Merrick. And I heard him tell that story to my teenage daughter on Sunday, just as one of the important lessons he had learned through this process is to always be a consensus builder and to build trust. And I think he was someone we could trust in this process. He was one of the lead folks from Justice with Jamie Gorelick and the team that put both the prosecution and the defense together. He believed in making sure that McVeigh had the best attorneys, the best team possible, and that Nichols had the best team possible, so that in the end there would be no reason that the case would not stand up both to the jury and to the appeals process. And I think, we've seen that worked, and his approach really worked well.
We're talking with Kerry Watkins, Executive Director of the Oklahoma City National Memorial. And Kerry, you bring up a good point. Throughout that trial, he made sure, even though documents were being volunteered from Ryder Truck or whoever, he made sure they had a subpoena, that things were being done by the book, thinking ahead down the road so that cases wouldn't be disrupted in some manner. How was he to work with?
Well, I've only come to know him in the last decade or so when we began to put the story together for the museum. But when we began to look at the prosecution and the defense, both folks said one of the key people you have to go talk to is Merrick Garland. And so we called him to set up his oral history and to talk to him about it. He was a little shy about doing it. And we began to explain why telling this story was so critical to kind of telling the big picture of the justice in the museum. And so he readily agreed. We went to his office one Friday afternoon, 5 years ago or so, and began to talk to him about his memories of this case. And as he began to reflect on both his work with the family members and the prosecution and the defense and the internal workings of the Justice Department and with the press, and why all that was important, why it was critical to take the case from Oklahoma City to Denver. I mean, he was critical in that process, and he explained that reasoning. Remember, the U.S. attorneys were in a shift of Vicki Miles LaGrange had just been appointed to the bench and federal bench, and so she had left the U.S. attorney's office, and there was an interim U.S. attorney there, and why it was important to have someone come in who looked at the case from a criminal perspective. And Merrick was the guy that Janet Reno and Jamie Gorelick sent in, and he really, now we look back 2 decades, his work has stood the test of time.
You mentioned he was a consensus builder. Was Judge Garland easy to deal with?
Well, I think for the families and survivors' perspective, they would tell you yes. I think, when they realized that they couldn't sit in the courtroom and listen to the trial and then be one of the victim's impact witness, they wanted to figure out how they could do that. And he explained that would take a change in the law. And so they went about changing the law through Congress to make sure they could sit in there and witness the trial and then do a victim's impact witness at the end. I think he understood both the emotional side and the legal side of this case, and how he had to bring those two worlds together, and not to rush to judgment, not to rush to the fact that while babies were killed and moms and dads and uncles and aunts were killed, but we had to make sure that we were setting forth to get the fairest trial. And I think if you look back at his talks and you look back at his oral history and different things, he talks about why that was so important, and it really had to stand through not one jury but 2, and then stand through the appeals process. And he understands that, and I think he really does understand and believe that that it's to do he looks at the big picture when he's making decisions.
You mentioned the oral history that he gave at the museum. He was recognized as well at the Reflections of Hope recently, right?
Well, last April, we honored both the prosecution and the defense, the justice team that brought the trials to both at the federal and the state levels. And why that was important was to show that justice isn't resolved with just a prosecution. It takes a strong defense to get to what we might call justice. McVeigh's family may not have found it to be justice, but I think that's where Merrick Garland is so good, is looking at the big picture. And when we began to interview the teams of the prosecution and the defense, they would talk about what a great job the Justice Department did in putting this piece of the puzzles together and making sure they looked at the whole picture. And you think back on that, and we thought about this last year on the 20th anniversary. This was the government who had to do this, the very government that McVeigh and Nichols tried to destroy, or tried to have an impact on. It was the very government that had to then stand up and put the right teams together to bring to trial these 2 cases. And I think that shows his big picture thinking, his fairness, his understanding of the complexity of this case. And I think you can look back at his history where he has been appointed by both a Republican and a Democrat, and I think he really is not about politics, he's about the procedures.
We're talking about Merrick Garland, President Obama's choice to succeed Antonin Scalia on the U.S. Supreme Court. Kerry, one last question for you. Merrick Garland, what's he like these days? You caught up with him recently.
Yeah, I spent some time with him Sundays. He gave a tour of his courthouse to my kids, and I think, it was fascinating to hear him recount this story. And I think he had been through the vetting process. We had turned documents over for the White House vetters to look at, and I think he was, looking back on it, he was extremely relaxed on Sunday. So either he knew it or was relaxed to know that he. The one question I asked on the way out: Are you ready to stand? To stand the test? And he said, "I am. I tried both the McVeigh Nichols case and the Unabomber case. I think I can handle Congress." And I think that was a good analogy of understanding where he was and where he is. I'm so proud to see him up there today with the president, to hear the president talk about his work in Oklahoma City. And I think it shows the relevance of the Oklahoma City bombing and that story and where we stand today. And very proud of Judge Garland, and we wish him the very best in this nomination process.
Judge Garland did say, quote, "the most important thing I've ever done in my life." Kerry Watkins, thank you so much for your time today. Good luck with the train situation there in Washington, D.C. Be safe getting home.
Thanks.
All right, we will stop down here for a second. News OK, we're streaming live this afternoon from the Oklahomans video studio. Chris Castile will join us from Washington, D.C. shortly. From the Oklahoman's Video Studios, good afternoon. I'm Dave Morris. This is our weekend review where we catch up with Chris Castile in Washington, D.C. to go over and preview various political events. Today we'll be talking about President Obama's nomination for the Supreme Court of the United States. We'll go over last night's action as Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton saw big wins. And we'll talk about Ben Carson leaving his Pentagon post. I mentioned Chris Castile. He joined us, there he is, via Skype from Washington, D.C. Sir, how are you?
I'm great, Dave. Thanks. How are you?
Doing quite well. It is a lovely day here. There is no train gridlock in Oklahoma City.
Well, you're lucky.
We just had a live interview with Kerry Watkins, and by the way, thank you for your help in facilitating that interview.
That's good. It was interesting.
It was interesting. She, of course, is the executive director of the Oklahoma City National Memorial, and she shared her thoughts on Merrick Garland, who's President Obama's nomination to succeed Antonin Scalia. And let's start there, Chris. Your thoughts on Merrick Garland? I assume he was on the short list. Was this a surprise?
Not a surprise. It was clear since Justice Scalia died in February that the president, more clear over the last few weeks anyway, that the president would try to come up with what, quote, consensus type candidate, a nominee who would fly through in non-election year. If this had been the first year of the president's term, it would be a totally different situation, I think. So not a total surprise that his name actually was on short lists for President Obama before, but again, it's a situation where the Republicans are just not going to budge on this. They have refused to. They won't even hold a hearing, they've said, for Judge Garland this year because it's an election year, and they have not budged off that today since the nomination became official.
As you mentioned, Oklahoma senators said today they don't want him considered for the vacancy on the U.S. Supreme Court, and we heard from U.S. Senator James Lankford earlier today.
Right.
The president has a responsibility constitutionally to nominate someone, but it's a 50-50 decision between the White House and between the United States Senate on any Supreme Court nominee. So the president has the first 50%. The Constitution is very clear that they actually put him in place, and he actually does the nomination. The second 50% is the Senate advice and consent. If the Senate says this is not the right time or this is not the right person, then they actually use that advice and consent. And we announced from the United States Senate a month ago that no, we're not going to try to move on someone in an election year. This has been the same thing that we've done throughout decades of history in the Senate, that we don't put people in the Supreme Court during the final year of an administration. Now we'll have other nominees. We'll have nominees for lower courts and circuit courts. We'll have nominees for cabinet officers, just like this week. We'll have lots of legislation. So the Senate is still open in doing business. But we've already laid down the marker. The same rule is going to apply this year as it has in previous years, that we don't nominate to the Supreme Court in the final months of a president's term.
So, Chris, is Merrick Garland ever going to see them actually consider his nomination?
No, they won't. And, I would just say it's just a waste of oxygen to kind of try to get in the middle of what the Democrats and the Senate say and the Republicans say about we did this. It's absolutely the worst when it comes to judicial nominations, the dueling statements, the dueling statistics and everything. It's all kind of a lot of nonsense too. And the fact that Judge Garland has this very strong, he's not an Oklahoman, but he obviously has this very strong Oklahoma connection. It's absolutely meaningless to the Oklahoma senators. And in the last year of Obama's first term, which would have been 2012, there was an Oklahoman up for a circuit, an appeals court position, much like the position that Judge Garland holds now, the appeals court in Denver, an Oklahoma City magistrate named Robert Bacharach. And he was talk about a bipartisan pick. I mean, there was nobody who was really against Bacharach. This position was open, had been open since Robert Henry went to OCU, and everybody's for it. Democrats tried to push his nomination through, tried to get a vote on the floor in the summer of 2012. Even Inhofe and Coburn, then Senator Tom Coburn, would not help the guy out. They didn't vote against him. They didn't really kind of even have the whatever you want to call it, to vote to do that. They just didn't vote. They were standing there in the chamber and just didn't vote. This is the state of nominations, judicial nominations in the United States Senate, and I don't really even want to. It's to most people it seems absurd, really. I mean, and you wonder why people hate Washington. But we Oklahoma City has 2 vacancies there on the district court, the lowest level of the federal judiciary. There in the Western District, the courthouse in Oklahoma City, there's 2 vacancies. And there have been nominees. The president made nominees after some recommendations from Oklahoma Senators Langford and Inhofe. The nominees came, I believe, in mid-December, and they've been on the Senate Judiciary Committee docket, since early January. They've gotten their questionnaires. The American Bar Association has said they're qualified. They were likely not even going to get hearings this year, and that's the lowest level. You heard Senator Langford talk about, we're going to do these nominations, No, they're not. They're pretty much done, I think, approving judges this year, and it's March. I mean, they may approve some district judges that have gotten through the whole process by now, but look, you're facing the fact that the Senate's almost never here. They're about to go on a two-week. So every time they come back from a recess, it's like a month later. So they just basically shut down the whole judicial confirmation process very early in a presidential election year. Sorry to go on so long about it.
We're chatting via Skype with Chris Castile from Washington, D.C., and just earlier in this hour, we chatted from that very studio with Kerry Watkins, Executive Director of the Oklahoma City National Memorial. And Chris, she shared her thoughts as she worked alongside Merrick Garland back during the Oklahoma City bombing process. What did you hear from her interview that kind of struck you? She is someone who knows Merrick quite well.
Well, I think that she has come to know him in the last decade again as a memorial and museum has tried to get a very complete record of everything that happened in the aftermath of the bombing. He was such a crucial part of it in those days immediately afterward, and throughout the process of the justice process, because of the steps that he took. As she mentioned, to make sure everything was done by the book. And President Obama talked about that today as well. I mean, that he's a real, quote, process guy, that he's not a partisan, that he's not, interested in ideology. What he's interested in is justice. That's what I thought Kerry Watkins did a really good job explaining today, that they got his oral history. They compiled all these documents that from his work, from his leadership of this investigation, to show that he wanted everything, every single I dotted and T crossed, so this thing was done right. And I think that, again, I mean, it just goes back to what I said at the beginning, that in a non-presidential election year, this thing would probably been sailed through in 2 months. Hearing soup to nuts, the thing would be over with.
I mentioned him as Merrick. No disrespect intended. That's Judge Garland to me. Moving on in our weekend review of politics here. Chris, a look back at last night. Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, the big winners. No surprises there.
Maybe it was kind of a surprise. I think that they both did so incredibly well last night. I mean, I believe the last time I looked at Missouri that Secretary Clinton still had a lead there. So she may have swept last night. It's over with. I mean, there's no path for Senator Sanders anymore. I mean, they can make this some kind of quixotic quest, stay on it, but why? It's just that the delegate math is just done, and I wouldn't be shocked if the senator got out in the next week or so. But he may want to take it all the way into June. Who knows? Or at least take it to the point that that she actually clinches the nomination with the number of delegates. And you look at Trump, he won 4 or 5, I believe, right? I mean, I think it may not have been officially called in Missouri yet. Missouri yet. It was like what 2,000, 3,000 votes between him and Ted Cruz. But really, what what argument do you make that any of these guys stand a chance? I mean, obviously Kasich does not. He won one of the 5 states last night. Marco Rubio in Florida won a single county in his home state.
He got the Miami County, I believe,
Exactly.
the southern tip down there.
Dade County, right?
Dade, yes.
So
Well, Kasich winning Ohio, and of course he told everybody that he would win Ohio. Is this him perhaps delaying the inevitable, or perhaps is this Governor Kasich becoming a vice presidential nominee down the road?
yeah, I don't know. I mean, what kind of integrity really would he have if he were to be, Donald Trump's running mate? If he wants to hold himself out as this one guy, who trying to bring an end to the madness, then you don't join it. But I know there's this media narrative. There's been a lot of national media narratives, none of which have shown to have much credibility. A week later, that there's going to be this brokered convention, as if Trump's going to go by, stomp all these guys in all these states, amass all these delegates, maybe get within spitting distance of the number needed. And then they're just going to take it away from him, and with some rule changes or some second ballot at the convention. I just I just think they just sit around making this stuff up. I would be stunned if that happened. And I don't see how you even do it, really. I mean, how do you go to the convention with all these Trump delegates and then somehow snatch it? It's just like I said. The media's got a different narrative about this every week.
Well, in the latest
I
narrative,
don't say Trump's going to be the nominee. I don't see how any way is stopping him, really. I mean, they may not like it. The quote establishment, the establishment that no longer has a candidate, really, in this race. I mean, who are these people anyway? And they're going to go to a convention. They have not been able to manage anything about this race so far. And they're going to go to the convention and manage that. I mean, that's just fantasy.
we heard today that Fox News was canceling its debate, I believe scheduled for the upcoming Monday. Donald Trump had already said he wasn't going to participate. I guess Fox News didn't want to have a Kasich versus Cruz debate. Will we see many more debates in the future?
I think Trump has, as he basically said, I don't want to do anymore. I don't think we need to. I'm not sure if you'll see another Republican primary debate. I think I can't remember if it was at a press conference 2 weeks ago or, after the last round of primaries before last night's, but he's basically said, I don't want to do them anymore. And if he doesn't go, then I don't think any network's going to want to televise a debate between Kasich and Cruz.
One last point to get to here today. Yesterday, you had the story on former Oklahoma Congressman Brad Carson leaving the Defense Department, planning to leave the Defense Department next month. What's the story there?
It's a weird story, and one I'm still trying to get at. But basically, he was nominated. He's been at the Pentagon in very important jobs and since very late 2011. He first was the general counsel for the Army. That's the top attorney for the United States Army. He was in the second ranking civilian at the U.S. Army, again, and a huge job. And then last year, about this time, President Obama nominated Brad Carson. He's a former Oklahoma congressman, a Democrat who represented Eastern Oklahoma, nominated him for a really important job, where the jurisdiction being what's called personnel and readiness, very broad jurisdiction. Well, he didn't get a confirmation hearing for almost a year, and that was true of all the really major Pentagon nominees, the civilians anyway, because John McCain, the senator from Arizona, is the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, was mad at the president. He's holding all the nominations, wouldn't hold any confirmation hearings because of he and the president were in this dispute over the annual defense bill. So none of them even got hearings. And so finally they get a hearing, and Carson was essentially ambushed by not only McCain, but also Senator Jim Inhofe, the Tulsa Republican, who's a senior member of the Armed Services Committee, who said he's kind of waving these anonymous allegations around, saying, we've got whistleblower type things, saying that, your office there at the Pentagon has become a hostile work environment, quote, hostile work environment. That's a fairly, that's a legal term of art, really. It means harassment. It often means sexual harassment. So Carson's sitting there stunned. Didn't know it was coming. And this is the type of thing, just to say that if you're a senator and you get allegations like that, I'm not saying that you can't, shouldn't, that's not my judgment to make about whether you just air them in public like that, without any kind of substantiation when the nominee's not even used to it. That's their call. But here's what happens a lot of times in that situation. They call them into their office, and they say, hey, look, we've got a few calls, a few letters about this. We need to look into this, and then maybe they'll set some kind of internal review about the allegations, see if they're substantiated, because they may not be. They may, and Inhofe admitted in his statements to Carson during this public hearing, none of this may be true.
In fact, you have that in your story. Inhofe did not list any of the specific complaints, acknowledged, just as you said, they may not be true, and Carson agreed to seek an internal review of his office. What happens next in this situation?
So I talked to a Pentagon spokesman last week. He said, okay, well, what Carson did was he came back to the Pentagon and initiated this internal review. So they were trying to kind of get the right structure for it. This is a huge department that they're going to have to do this review of, who do you ask, what do you ask them to try to get at, whatever it is you're trying to find out. But I think that, and Carson has not commented about this beyond a public statement he made on Monday. I'm leaving the Pentagon in April, blah, I enjoyed my time here, that kind of thing. But the writing was on the wall. He just got brutalized by McCain over some things, and then by Inhofe and by Jeff Sessions of Alabama. That's not a good indication that you're going to get, that committee is going to advance your nomination. Now, I went to, and I was convinced really after that day that they probably weren't even going to hold a vote on it. So I caught John McCain in the hall of the Senate yesterday, and I said, were you even going to hold a vote on him? And he goes, oh, yeah, we were going to. But I don't know, maybe that vote would never, maybe they would never have been satisfied that they had enough information to ever hold of it. We won't know now, but I guess the bottom line is that Brad Carson is going to be leaving the Pentagon, next month. And that this one of the lasting memories of him up here will be this confrontation. It wasn't even really a confrontation. It was this, this exchange with Jim Inhofe, who I should say, Jim Inhofe did support Carson for those other two Pentagon posts, both of which required Senate confirmation, the General Counsel to the Army and then the Undersecretary of the Army. Those both required confirmation as well. And I couldn't be more puzzled about this. I'm supposed to talk to Inhofe about it tomorrow, and I'll be really curious to hear what he says. These guys, just by way of some background, these guys had a pretty big conflict when Brad Carson was in Congress, and that was from like 2001 to 2005, over an area in eastern Oklahoma called Tar Creek, which was an area very polluted by mining, decades ago, and it was the state, the federal government, kind of just wrestled with it for a long time. What do we do with these people that live in this? We got to get them out of here. There's like all these, all this incredible exposure to poison around there. Carson really wanted to move everybody out, to get federal funding to evacuate everybody who lived in this area, relocate them, buy their homes, and relocate them. Inhofe didn't. So they had some pretty nasty exchanges, about this. And years later, I would say, Inhofe actually went to, when Carson had already left Congress, Inhofe came around to Carson's position and actually secured the money to relocate all those people.
Good stuff. Good analysis, good context. That's why we talk to our man in Washington every week, is for a weekend review. He mentioned, Chris Castile, he mentioned Tar Creek. That entire coverage in the archives can be found online at newsok.com, and it's extensive coverage that we have online as well. Yes. Chris, a lot going on this week, a lot going on today. Thank you so much for your time. We very much appreciate it.
All right, Dave, glad to do it. Take care.
All right, and more political coverage can be found in the Oklahoman and online at newsok.com. That'll do it for this week in Review and Politics.